Before the football season started this year, I did a video and it was talking about the impact of a major rule change that had occurred in football. Whether you're betting on football or whether you're doing some Betfair trading on football matches, the rule change was the added time at the end of the first and second half and what impact that would have. Now, all of that has come true and the things that I said would happen have actually happened. But the interesting thing is, I reckon this is about to change again for a completely different reason. So if you're doing anything or you've had some success so far this season, this is an important video to watch to understand what happens next. If you're interested in Betfair trading and you want to learn how to trade, then visit the Academy where you can do exactly that. If you want to talk to professional Betfair traders, then why not head over to our forum where you can talk to like-minded people, but you can also download additional content. And don't forget to head over to our website to download a copy of BetAngel, the cutting-edge software that will completely transform your trading. So I'm not going to spend too much time going in depth about exactly what I said in the previous video, but it's worth reprising it again to bring you up to speed and get you to the point where we need to be within this video. Because before the season started, I said that the extra time that was going to be added onto the matches would radically change the availability of odds and the pricing within the market, and therefore there was an opportunity while we waited for the market to catch up with us. And generally speaking, more time within a match is going to produce more goals, and then more goals will obviously affect the individual markets, but you could do it in a number of subtle ways. So when we look at the over and under goal market, that will be the easiest market to work out because you've got an actual physical number. And therefore you can sort of tweak that up slightly to take account of any added extra time. But the interesting thing comes when we look at the correct score market, because that will subtly influence what sort of pricing would be in the correct score market and the opportunities that you see within that. But it would also affect the match odds market. And that's for a very good reason, because the smaller number of goals within the market, then there is a higher chance of a draw. So if we had a match that had 2 goals in it, they could be equally shared. But if we had a match with 3 goals in it, those 3 goals couldn't be equally shared. So if you increase the number of goals, then you decrease the chance of a draw. That makes perfect logical mathematical sense. So one of the upshots of this that I hypothesized before the season started would be that draws would occur less frequently. And therefore, from a Betfair trading perspective, you would probably find that the lay the draw strategy would work particularly well. And that would simply reflect the increase in the large number of goals. So let's understand exactly what has happened so far this season. So just before we dive into the nitty-gritty, some of the numbers around what we're doing here, I'll just explain the methodology quickly that I'm going to use. I'm looking at 3 key markets to keep things concise. We're looking at over-unders, correct score and match odds. But more specifically, we're looking at what happens if you lay these. So we would lay unders, we would go into the correct score market. And again, to simplify things, I'm going to lay 0-0, which I'll explain why in a second. And for the match odds market, because of our understanding of the influence that extra goals would have, we're going to lay the draw, which again, I will explain in a second. But that's the methodology that I'm going to use here for the next section of this video. So over the course of the season so far, I've traded or bet on about 5,300 matches and rising as the season progresses. Well, I say matches, markets, I should say, because some of these matches I will be active in several different markets. So the number of matches I bet on, I don't know exactly what it is, but it will be maybe 1/3 of that total. But fundamentally speaking, I've picked on 3 simple markets so that this video is reasonably concise and looked at how they have changed and whether they reflected the true odds or not. The market with the least amount of change was the over and under market. The variation that we saw on there was only about 0.24%. It was really quite small. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's an easy market to price and understand. If you think there are going to be more goals, less, and so on, quite easy to factor that in. When we look at the correct score market, there are quite a lot of variations within this market. In the previous video, I covered specifically the variations by scoreline. So I will link to that video so that we can keep this one reasonably concise. But if, for example, I look at the 0-0, the 0-0 is a direct reflection on the number of goals that are likely within a market. And we can see that that's varied by about 0.6% against true odds. Now, when we talk about odds, most people and most money gets bet on the match odds, which is the home win, the draw, or the away win. And that is the market that has shown the most variability so far this year, because if we look more specifically at the draw, with a view to understanding how that's going to influence the lay the draw strategy, whether you're betting or trading, that shows the biggest variation. It's about 1.3%. Now, all of these percentages are quite small, and that is because I've grouped everything together in one big chunk of data. But fundamentally speaking, that isn't how you should be doing your trading. You shouldn't be looking across all of the markets all of the time. You should be focusing in on specific opportunities. So let's break that out and understand specifically where we expect to see the biggest opportunities. So before we move on to where the big variations are, and more specifically how you can find them, it's worth noting that, of course, within BetAngel, we have the predicted goals feature that will look at all of the markets and tell you where the most goals will be and where the least goals will be, and also give you a number that you can hang your hat on if you have a specific type of strategy. It's a very effective way of narrowing down the field and looking at specific markets where goals are more or less likely. So yeah, make sure you use that feature if you're interested in what I'm talking about in this video. So if we look at that previous data, you're thinking, well, these are tiny, small edges. There's not really much in there for me at all. But that's because you're looking at it the wrong way. And it's the same way that a lot of academics look at things when they say that the market is efficient, because they can say, look at all of this data and, the odds more or less represent the chance of something happening. But of course, they're casting a broad brush. If you want to prove something with statistics, you more or less can. It works both ways, to be honest. But fundamentally speaking, the bigger data set that you have, of course, everything is going to be much, much closer to reality because one thing will net off another. So you have to drill down a bit and go more specifically into detail. You would pick matches, you would pick leagues, you would pick countries to make these things much more effective. And it's sort of quite easy to explain, because if we look at Spanish La Liga against the same stats, what we find is we have no edge there at all by pursuing any of the strategies that we just discussed. If we sort of laid 0-0, laid the draw and backed overs or laid unders, whichever way you want to do it, that would have returned 0 to -5% so far this season. However, if you do it in the English Premier League, you end up with an edge of somewhere between 2 to 4%, or maybe a little bit more. And if you refine it further in terms of more competitive matches and variance therein and thereof, then that percentage gets even higher. So it's really important to understand that the broader data you look at, the less edge you're going to find. And you want to look at data that's a little bit narrower than that, but not too narrow. One of the classic mistakes of data analysis is you look at a whole set of data and it says the horse that begins with the letter L that runs left to right and whatever on a certain course has historically met, but it's 0.0000001% of entire data. So you don't want to go that narrow, but you can start to break out and look at things individually. But of course, on this occasion, it makes perfect logical sense because more goals are scored in the Premier League. I've got some data down here, which I'm going to have to look at because I can't remember off the top of my head. But season 2021, the Premier League had 2.69 goals, then it was 2.82, 2.85, and this year it's gone up to 3.11. So there are more goals being scored in the Premier League, as we've predicted. But if we look at La Liga, you can see it goes 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, 2.67. So there are many more goals being scored in the Premier League, less in the Spanish La Liga. And as a consequence, there are going to be more draws in La Liga. And in fact, if we look at the 0-0, in the Premier League so far this season, there's only been 2.5% of matches have ended up as a 0-0. So 97.5% of games are having goals within them of some sort or another. But if we look at La Liga, it's nearly 8.5% of matches are ending up at 0-0, and there are more draws. So there's a radical difference between leagues there. And that you can play all of that to your advantage. But fundamentally speaking, the broader data that you get, the more accurate the odds are going to be because positive and negative cancel each other out. But when you focus in a bit, then you begin to see large variations across individual league. So when we look at the English Premier League, that is the best strategy to back overs or lay unders, whichever way you want to do it, to lay the draw or to lay 0-0, even if you want to go to that level. And the worst league to do that in is La Liga. And some of the other leagues are sort of in between each of those individual amounts. But yeah, there's a big variation depending upon how you look at the data. So something funny has happened so far this season, and that is my timeline is filled up with tipping services for football and trading services and people saying just how fantastically well that they've done. But of course, now you know the reason why, and that is because there's a fundamental shift in the market. it would be very, if you've laid the draw, if you've backed overs to a lesser extent, or you've done any of the things that I've talked about in this video, you would have done really well so far this season just by default. Of course, if you are a specialist in the Spanish La Liga, then you would have done really badly. But of course, we know the underlying metrics behind that. We know it's driven by goals, and it's the goals that are having an impact. We know that La Liga has many less than the English Premier League. But that also tells us about the future, because most people who are doing this and have just sort of stumbled across this and done it by random, they had a strategy, it just suddenly is working a lot better, and suddenly they're a god of some sort. We know the reason why that isn't the case. So that allows you to keep looking forward to understand if the market corrective is kicking in. Because I sit down every Monday, I look at my results week on week, month on month, year on year. I analyse all of the data, I look at the individual leagues, I look at the bets that I placed and how they performed, and I can start to form that judgment, because my anticipation now is that the corrective should kick in at some individual point, but at the moment that doesn't appear to be the case. But I would expect either the odds to adjust to the new paradigm that we're seeing now, or the number of goals to start sort of declining or something like that. And that's what I'm looking at all of the time, because I'm not sort of saying, and this is the biggest mistake that people make when they're betting, is they look at historical data and they go, oh my God, look at this. And then they base their future on that when, you know, sometimes they're just not related, or things change between one and the other. And I guarantee you that lots of people out there who are doing really, really well on football this season will start raising their stakes at the exact moment at which it will stop working, and therefore they'll probably end up losing money over the course of the season. But my approach, and your approach too, should be to review all of that data, keep looking at all of the stats, trying to make sense of exactly why that is the case and how those goals are influencing the outcomes within these markets, how many goals are changing, and whether the market is accurately discounting it. Because what that will allow you to do is not only look at stuff historically and understand why that was the case, but it will allow you to look forward and measure your success and your progress on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis over the course of the season. But what you should be doing is basically looking at all of that data, understanding exactly why that's the case. Hopefully I've given you enough information to do that, and that should put you in a good position for the rest of the season.